Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gen AI Con. I am delighted to have with us Dr. Pavan Duggal, who is an advocate at the Supreme Court of India, chairman of the International Commission of Cybersecurity Law. While practicing as an advocate of the Supreme Court in India, Dr. Pavan has made an immense impact with an international reputation as an expert and authority on cyber law, cybersecurity law, cybercrime, artificial intelligence, and e-commerce law. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you on your conference.
Wonderful. So I'll hand it over to you to deliver your fascinating talk on generative AI and the legal and policy challenges in our time.
Thank you. Well, good evening, good morning, good night, depending on which side of the world you are in. But there's one common denominator that's joining us today all, and that continues to be generative artificial intelligence. Because whether you like it or not, generative artificial intelligence is here to stay. And therefore, we need to be dealing with the various nuances, including the legal and the policy challenges pertaining to generative AI. It's in this context that I thought I have a small presentation. Maybe I can share my presentation and I can take you through what I see on the horizon that's emerging. So when I look at generative AI, legal and policy challenges in our times, I get a lot of ideas in my mind, primarily because things are pretty hazy, rightfully so, primarily because things are in a state of evolution. And when things are evolving, things are in a state of flux. So the legal and policy aspects pertaining to generative AI is also in a flux. The latest news first. Recently, the Italian privacy watchdog has stated that OpenAI's ChatGPT breaches the privacy rules. Well, ChatGPT is looking to go ahead and ensure that the gaps are reduced. But the fact remains is that we are today all living in the age of the digital economy. And in this new digital economy, newly emerging technologies are beginning to have their impact and significance felt. But when I talk about generative AI, I talk of basically deep learning models that can generate high quality text, images, and other content based on the data that they are trained on. I look at the market size and I'm amazed. Why? Because the market size of generative AI in 2024 is projected to reach almost 66.62 billion US dollars. The market size is expected to show an annual growth rate of 20.80%. And that's going to lead to a massive market volume of 207 billion US dollars by 2030. Now, as compared to the global comparison, the US market will be the biggest market, as it's expected to be around 23.20 billion by the time it's 2024 end. But while we have these generative artificial intelligence programs like ChatGPT, they are effectively music to the ears of the users. Why? Your entire search engine ecosystem, the search engine ecosystem is being disrupted. They are providing direct, crystal clear answers to specific questions, which normally is going to take a lot of time for you to go ahead and use search engines in this regard. First and foremost, let's look at major legal and policy challenges of generative AI. The first challenge is the legality of generative AI. Now, obviously, for answering this question, there has to be a presumption that there's going to be some law that's going to make generative AI legal. But that's not the position. The position is, till such time as the law does not make any technology illegal, the technology continues to be legal. So by that stretch, generative AI can be deemed to be legal till such time it's actually banned or made illegal by any legislation. As of now, when I talk, I realize that India, or forget about India, any country in the world does not have any dedicated law on artificial intelligence in its complete totality. It's like the one elephant and five blind men trying to describe the elephant. So different aspects of artificial intelligence are being sought to be addressed by the various nation states. So we find the holistic all throughout AI law that the European Union has passed in December 2023. We look at employment-specific law on AI that New York has passed. We look at the world's first law on generative artificial intelligence, which has been passed and implemented in China in August 2023. But when I look at the international level, I realize that there is a complete vacuum. No international treaty on AI, no even global acceptance of legal principles. Then if generative AI is legal, the next question that comes up for consideration is whether the output of generative AI is legal. Well, at the end of the day, generative AI is nothing but AI algorithms which are communicating with the users in a conversational dialogue form. Therefore, just as generative AI is legal, it has to be presumed that all the output of generative AI also must be deemed to be legal and deemed to have the sanctity of the law. This is also thanks primarily to the provisions of various cyber laws in different parts of the world. The cyber laws in different parts of the world have granted legality to the electronic format. And because ultimately output of Gen AI is nothing but an electronic record, it has the same sanctity and validity as that of a normal electronic record, which has been granted legality under the various cyber laws in different parts of the world. Further, the problem is because there are so many complexities that generative AI is beginning to throw up, there's now a huge list of online and physical world disputes that have risen and that are continued to be filed against companies which are coming up with Gen AI platforms or algorithms, whether it's Microsoft, OpenAI, Stability AI, GitHub, and etc. Most of the lawsuits so far are basically trying to break new ground as far as copyright law is concerned. Well, the common grouse is that we are the owners of our original literary and artistic works. We have got the copyright in the same, and your generative AI algorithms have been trained on our copyrighted works, which has led to infringement of our copyright, and therefore there's been prayers sought, including for declaration and for damages. But the question is, while that matter is sub judice and we'll have to be awaiting the actual position of decision by different courts, another important challenge is what is the legality of a Gen AI contract? Now you will say, what is a Gen AI contract? A Gen AI contract is a contract that's entered into between a generative AI algorithm and its user. In a normal common parlance, it can be said, you see, when there's an offer, and then when the offer is accepted, that leads into a valid binding contract. But then can I say that I can enter into a legal contract with a generative AI? At the end of the day, a generative AI contract is entered in the electronic format. But it has also got some connection with artificial intelligence. But the problem is artificial intelligence has not yet being granted the legality of being a legal entity. So consequently, the problem is under the existing contract laws in different parts of the world, we find that the law mandates that the contracting parties must be in a legal position to contract. But if one of the parties in a Gen AI contract is going to be a generative artificial intelligence algorithm, which is itself not being legally recognized as a legal entity, then the question is whether the so-called contract or an agreement between the parties can be presumed or can be called as a generative AI algorithm. I think the bigger issue is we will still have to deal with the issue pertaining to legality of generative AI as a legal entity before we can start answering these fundamental questions. The problem, another, is that users today are very trusting and they are beginning to start sharing information about their personal, professional, social lives on generative AI without even thinking about the privacy ramifications of the same. So much so that private client information and confidential data is now increasingly being shared with the various Gen AI platforms. Now, as and when a Gen AI platform or an algorithm is giving you answers, it could also open up the users to contractual disputes. Because if a company or an individual user were to put a client's confidential information as an input into a generative AI program while they're doing business, then purely they're going to be playing into fire because they are likely to be exposed in contract and even tort law. So using generative AI with care needs to become the topmost mantra for all users. Otherwise, if you are going to be reckless, careless, then be rest assured the exposure to legal consequences and contractual liability is going to be an extremely important hurdle that you will have to cross as a user of generative AI. Yet another important legal and policy challenge pertaining to generative AI deals with the relationship of generative AI with cybercrime. Now, you will say a majority of the generative AI platforms have already taken substantial care to ensure that their algorithms don't give answers to questions which are illegal or answer questions which are bordering on the illegality or the penalty of different provisions. So does that mean that's the end of the problem? Definitely not. Why? Because now with prompt command engineering coming in a big time, we can actually use these prompt commands to force the Gen AI to actually give you information that can help you commit crimes. So generative AI can be used for committing cybercrimes, either inadvertently or consciously by users. Consequently, we can even find that generative AI can also become victims of cybercrimes, as cyber criminal activity can be potentially targeted against generative AI. And in a scenario like this, once a cybercrime happens which is targeting a generative AI algorithm, then one thing is very clear, that kind of an activity can be distinctly covered under the existing cybercrime laws in different parts of the world. Well, if you don't have cybercrime laws in your country, no problem. You could still try to cover the same under the national penal laws of your relevant country, and then hope that maybe you are successful in getting convictions. But there is a problem. How do you attribute the said Gen AI crime to a definitive cyber actor? So the problem is that users are most likely going to be using generative AI for a variety of criminal or illegal purposes beyond the scope of the services that are provided by the said generative AI providers. Now, already, when I look at the cyber laws across the world, I find there are some countries who have dedicated cyber laws and dedicated cybercrime laws. There are other countries who have chosen to have just one cyber law, and there are cyber criminal provisions for cyber crimes as part of the said cyber law. There's yet another set of countries who have not any dedicated law on cybercrime or cyber law, but who just would still want to rely upon the provisions of their penal laws so as to go ahead and deal with the emerging challenges of AI crimes. So everything is going to depend upon what's actually existing in a particular jurisdiction to determine how the AI crimes in those jurisdictions are going to be addressed. Yet another very important legal and policy challenge that generative AI is going to throw up is going to relate to cybersecurity in generative AI. Now, it's very important for us to understand that merely presuming generative AI to be secure will not necessarily make it secure. So therefore, generative AI, in order to be effective, must be made cyber secure in the sense that it should be potentially protected from any cyber attacks or cyber intrusions by cyber criminals and cyber security breaches. And for that, cogent human action and activity is required to be taking place. For that, of course, appropriate steps will have to be taken up so as to ensure the cybersecurity of Gen AI algorithms and Gen AI as a paradigm. But the problem is not much has been done legally in this direction in terms of ensuring the cybersecurity of generative artificial intelligence. So in the event there's a breach of any act of cybersecurity parameter of generative AI, then it can be argued that the existing national cybersecurity laws in different countries could be equally made applicable in the context of the breach of Gen AI. Logically so, and in case if the provisions of your national cybersecurity laws are broad and generic enough, then these kinds of activities could be brought enough under the ambit of your national cyber security laws. But what happens to those countries who do not yet have dedicated national cybersecurity laws? For them, this continues to be a gray zone. Some countries have also now begun to start coming up with national data breach notification legislations. Maybe some portion of the breach of cybersecurity of Gen AI could even be brought under the ambit of these data breach notification laws as well. Yet another important legal and policy challenge that Gen AI is beginning to throw up relates to the privacy ramifications of Gen AI. Why? Because a Gen AI algorithm is invariably not just trained on collected data, but it is also simultaneously, invariably, collecting information all the time. Hence, while it's generating new kinds of content, it's possible that the output of generative AI chatbot could potentially go ahead and violate not just the data privacy, but even the personal privacy of individual users. Hence, the blindfolded approach of blindly accepting and trusting any generative AI algorithm has to now give way to more saner approach of being more hesitant, being suspicious of how your data is going to be dealt with by generative AI platforms, and as far as possible to avoid sharing your personal data, confidential data, or sensitive personal data to these Gen AI platforms. Now, you can always say that Gen AI platforms are going to be governed by the national laws on privacy in different countries. Logically so. But then, how many countries have dedicated laws on privacy? We find it's only a handful of countries. A majority of third world countries do not have dedicated laws pertaining to protection of privacy. So in such a scenario, I think there'll be a very urgent need for lawmakers to come up with dedicated new legal provisions for regulating Gen AI in such a manner so that the Gen AI does not go ahead and violate the privacy of its users. Yet another important legal challenge thrown up by Gen AI is going to relate to data protection. Why? Because Gen AI would be dealing with and is indeed dealing with a lot of data, including personal data. Further, they are collecting a lot of data. This could include sensitive personal data, normal personal data, which would require to be appropriately protected and preserved as per the prevailing national data protection laws. Now, there are some countries who have dedicated laws on data protection. If you are residing in those countries, then clearly data protection would tend to get covered under the national laws. But for a majority of countries who do not have dedicated laws on data protection, then you realize that clearly this is one big area that will require immediate attention. Why? because the operator who makes the chatbot accessible to the customer has to ensure that the chatbot complies with the relevant data processing principles, namely the legality, good faith, correctness, proportionality, purpose limitation, security, and transparency principles of data protection in those jurisdictions who have dedicated laws on data protection. Another important legal issue pertaining to Gen AI in today's time deals with the accountability of decisions taken by generative AI. Now, from the outside, when it looks, it's obviously very clear that it's very difficult to determine how the decision to give the output is being taken by generative artificial intelligence algorithm. And therefore, now this is one very gray zone where work is required to be done. Already, as per this news article, generative AI is now forcing people to rethink what it means to be authentic. So blindfoldly accepting the output of Gen AI is now no longer going to be acceptable. Now, as per this new report that's come in the public domain, AI can help auditors detect corporate frauds through smart analysis. So generative AI is also going to be very much capable in this regard. So when you are dealing with this kind of information, another important legal and policy challenge thrown up by generative AI deals with its safety. How safe is generative AI? And if it is not so safe, what needs to be done so as to make it more safe? So therefore, it's very important that any deployment of generative AI needs to be done in such a manner so that it is deployed more safely, specifically in the context of sensitive industries like transportation, healthcare, banking, and finance. Now, today we begin to start also realizing that number of times chatbots don't behave properly. So if a chatbot provides abusive or offensive responses to a customer, then clearly it's not just a case of chatbot going rogue, it's also a case of the fact that the personality rights of the customer could be unlawfully infringed. And as a result, the customer could bring in a claim for damages against the chatbot operator. Yet another very important issue pertaining to chatbots and generative AI relates to copyright and other intellectual property rights and the respective infringements. Well, in the month of February 2024, the House of Lords specific committee has now come up with a new report. This committee has told the government in crystal clear terms that the time for the government to wake up is now. Why? Because the government cannot keep on deferring coming up with legal provisions till such time appropriate case law gets developed. And they are saying that while generative AI is valuable to society, yet it cannot be permitted to go ahead and violate the copyright and other intellectual property rights of users. The problem is that the Gen AI algorithm are generating content out of information that's available in the public domain. A number of instances we have now seen that the Gen AI algorithm is actually being tested or is actually being trained on copyrighted data that's intellectually protected by various legal frameworks. Now, in that case, it can create a lot of problems. Typically, when a Gen AI is giving its output, it can be argued that Gen AI could be considered as a creator of original content for the purposes of copyright law. But one of the biggest concerns pertaining to Gen AI deals with how to cope up with the copyright issues thrown up by generative AI. Gen AI actually is allowing any person to generate any kind of a content depending on the command that the said person is going to go ahead and provide for. Technically, the person who creates the original literary work becomes the owner of the same and therefore is entitled to copyright. Technically speaking, when a user, Mr. X, puts in a query and gets an answer from generative AI, it's Mr. X as a person who becomes the author of the output of generative AI, inasmuch as the said output did not exist earlier, prior to the said query being made by the said person, being Mr. X, to generative AI. That appears to be a logical approach, but a bigger issue that's now coming up is, can we now consider generative AI algorithms as creators of original content? Now, there's a huge bunch of litigations and legal actions across the world. By and large, the patent authorities and regulators in different parts of the world are increasingly converging on the ground that when you are talking of a patent, that only needs to be given to a human who has created or invented the said new invention. And there's a distinct hesitancy to consider the AI algorithm as an inventor or as a co-inventor. So I think the same hesitancy is going to be replicated in the scenario when regulators are going to see whether generative AI algorithms can be considered as creators of original content. It's also possible that a Gen AI could actually come out with output which could potentially be infringing the intellectual property rights of others, specifically in the context of circumstances when they are going to generate such kind of a content without the permission of the original owner of the intellectual property rights. So that's where it's a big gray zone. There's no clarity on how the law has to evolve, but it's going to be very important for us to realize that it's very much possible that the output of generative AI could contain content which is already copyrighted and which belongs to a respected copyright owner. In that case, plagiarism by generative AI is itself going to become a big challenge as far as AI policy and regulation is going to be concerned. This is so because generative AI algorithms are going to be all based on training on predefined data sets. And these data sets may themselves be containing data which is, or information which is protected by intellectual property rights. So yet another very big challenge in the context of generative AI is going to deal with the hallucination element of Gen AI. Today, when you are dealing with or researching or reading through the results of generative AI, you have to take those results with a pinch of salt. Why? Because in the context of AI algorithms, hallucination is now getting more and more prevalent. In fact, hallucination as a concept has been used to refer to a phenomenon wherein the AI bot is itself creating information as a figment of its imagination and thus hallucinating content. And I think the confidence with which generative AI speaks incorrect information or hallucinates, that itself foxes a large number of innocent users. So with huge volumes of hallucination and hallucinated content being generated by generative AI, then it's very, very safe that you cannot now today rely upon the output from the AI algorithm, whether it's ChatGPT or whether it's any other program, as being correct, authentic, or accurate. And one of the most significant legalities pertaining to generative AI will also pertain to the legal liability of generative AI for the hallucination of its outputs. So can we say that the company which has developed, or the coders who have developed the Gen AI algorithm, can wash their hands off, can walk off, and cannot be exposed to legal liability? I don't think that's the direction the jurisprudence is likely to continue. The reason is you need to give far more accountability and far more transparency when you're creating a Gen AI algorithm. Now, when I switch sides and go on to the side of the AI creators, I can argue that, look, hey guys, we are only in the research phase. We are giving you technology that's in the process of development. So we are ourselves not going to go ahead and stand guarantee for the authenticity of the results. In fact, in our disclaimers, we are often telling you these results may be inaccurate, may actually contain inaccuracies, so please handle with care. So once I've already pre-warned you I'm a mere service provider, and that being so, I should be entitled to my exemption from legal liability. It's a very interesting time to see how this entire issue of tortious liability of the AI service providers is going to pan up in the context of output given by generative AI. Now, the problem is because more and more people have begun to start relying upon Gen AI, there's possibility that they could be relying blindfoldedly upon output of Gen AI. And as a result of such blind reliance, they could themselves be suffering some legal harm, legal injury. If that happens, then the question is who is going to be responsible for the same? That's one big area that lawmakers will really have to concentrate on as we move forward. And yet another important legal ramification and challenge pertaining to generative AI pertains to misinformation that's generated by generative AI and the consequent harm and the legal liability in this regard. Today, the entire issue of jurisdiction in Gen AI is itself becoming very, very hot, complicated, and complex. Why? Because generative AI algorithms can be located in servers in any parts of the world. And they could be providing those services, their services, to other users who are located in other parts of the world. So in a scenario like this, in case if there's a dispute, where would the jurisdiction lie? And how will the courts come to the conclusion that they will have either the exclusive or the concurrent jurisdiction to try the disputes arising out of the use of generative AI? So that's one area that work needs to be done. Yet another very big legal and policy challenge of generative AI in today's times deals with its bias. Now, you can't say that generative AI is today totally independent and totally free from bias. In fact, because Gen AI is invariably trained on big data sets, therefore the bias in the big data sets itself is going to reflect in the manner how generative AI is providing its outputs. And therefore, because of the bias, it's very much possible that generative AI could be actually perpetuating discrimination. And this is a much bigger threat that's posed by generative AI than possible extinction of the human race. Well, this is as per the statement given by the EU's competition commissioner. On the one hand, you have Elon Musk, who's saying that artificial intelligence is an existential threat to humanity. And on the other hand, you have others who are saying, don't worry, you have still things under control. But the reality is that the time is shrinking. Earlier, they used to say that only by 2062 that AI is going to supersede human intelligence. As time passed by, the said figures of timelines were revised. They came up to 2045, then 2042. Then Sam Altman in 2023 highlighted that this tipping point could come in as early as 2035. And in the third quarter of 2023, OpenAI launched its super intelligence alignment project, which says, give us guys 4 years, plus and minus some time, and we will create a new super intelligence that will be far superseding human intelligence. So the actual chances of AI superseding our intelligence is going to be coming forward in the next few years. And therefore, we need to be prepared for the same. Yet another important legal issue pertaining to generative AI concerns consumer protection. So when I'm a consumer and I use generative AI program, it may be possible that the output services which are provided by the generative AI algorithm may not be up to the mark, or the content may be hallucinated, or the content may be made up or false. In such a scenario, how do you go ahead and protect consumers from this onslaught of hallucinated, false, or fabricated information? And then whether generative AI companies must recognize the necessity of generative AI being amenable to consumer protection laws or not. I think a majority of consumers will say they ought to be made amenable to consumer protection laws, but there's not much clarity in this regard. One of the biggest legal and policy challenges that Gen AI today is throwing up pertains to the ethical and the moral issues pertaining to generative AI. So since generative AI is nothing but the cognitive intelligence of machines, generative AI itself would not be in a position to determine whether its output is going to be ethical or moral. And therefore, there's a growing necessity and a growing noise in the direction that generative AI must be responsible AI, must be trustworthy, and for that, appropriate policy and legal frameworks need to be put in place. Of course, there are going to be some rogue generative AIs as well. And because these rogue generative AIs are going to be made available on the darknet, they can actually engage in theft of personal data, bank account details. They could be abusive, could even help ventilate misleading responses and negative sentiments. How do you go ahead and deal with that? I think there will be need for appropriate legal frameworks to deal with an entire issue of generative AI algorithms going rogue. But the bigger issue is, how are you going to enforce your laws, your legal provisions in the context of generative AI? It's here that I believe that the role of generative AI companies, development companies, assume far more significance, because they must have in place appropriate policies pertaining to Gen AI product promotion and advertising, also putting in appropriate parameters of due diligence at the time when they are creating those said Gen AI platforms or algorithms. Further, yet another important issue is what kind of fundamental policies should generative AI service providers have? I'm very clear that generative AI service providers must give crystal clear information on their websites or on their platforms as to what are their policies and how they are going to deal with information of the users of the said Gen AI platforms. Because the user ultimately has a basic fundamental right to know to whom they are speaking to, what kind of content is going to be leashed out to them. It's therefore very essential that these companies who are developing and implementing generative AI must have internal policies that govern how generative AI is going to be implemented after defining the permissible activities of generative AI algorithms and related chatbots. Currently, when I look at the global scenario, I find most of the countries are right now in a wake-up mode. They are currently beginning to wake up to the need for getting up for regulating artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence. Most of the countries are still in the wait and watch approach. They are waiting and watching to see what other players are doing, and then they would want to take the next step. So I believe at this juncture, it needs to be noted that the relevant coders who have created the relevant generative artificial intelligence codes or algorithms cannot go scot-free. They need to be made legally more responsible for the development of the said codes of generative AI. Therefore, the entire issue of legal liability for acts done by generative AI is growing, is going to get far more complex, and will have to be effectively addressed by lawmakers and policymakers with the passage of time. I think another legal and policy ramification of generative AI pertains to its ability for social manipulation. Generative AI can be used for manipulating thought processes, social perspectives, and therefore it could effectively change the minds and perspectives of users per se. Look at the new law on generative AI that China has implemented on 15th of August 2023, a law which is particularly focusing on ensuring that the said Gen AI platforms and algorithms should not create any negative prejudicial impact upon the minds of the people or society at large. Of course, these regulations have come up. The bigger issue is, how are these regulations going to be enforced? In the Chinese context, they still could be enforced given their social and political structures. But in a lot of other countries, assuming you come up with legal provisions, the bigger issue will be, how do we actually go ahead and enforce the same? So when I'm looking at the European Union's first draft AI law, which they have passed in December 2023, the bigger issue is what kind of mechanisms are going to be adopted in this particular law in the context of generative AI, and how is this law going to be effectively enforced? Similarly, when I'm looking at the new law on AI that's available in New York, The important issue is the said law is focused on employment issues. But how are you going to effectively enforce the said provisions of the law is still a big question. So bottom line is, it's a very interesting time of history that we are in. The landscape is beginning to evolve and emerge in a very rapid manner as far as generative AI is concerned. And there's no denying the fact that generative AI platforms are now increasingly going to be used by various stakeholders in various verticals of human activities and endeavors. So this generative AI platforms have taken the conversation onto the next level. So people are not just fascinated by the intrinsic ability of generative AI programs to dish out information, but are also wondering whether this particular Gen AI could spell the doom or the destruction of large number of industries per se. Good and bad things are all together. There's nothing known as a complete black or a complete white. It's a gray zone that generative AI is working in. And all in all, I believe that generative AI will continue to be a very important paradigm of our times. But clearly, the legal, policy, and regulatory issues pertaining to generative AI must be appropriately addressed by relevant stakeholders as we move forward. These legalities have to be addressed at the earliest, and they have to ultimately be seen as contributing to the overall growth of jurisprudence of AI law as we go forward. And AI law or artificial intelligence law is a sub-domain or a sub-discipline that's emerging under the broad cyber law umbrella. Well, in New Delhi, we have created the Artificial Intelligence Law Hub, which I'm heading, and it's primarily looking at how the legal principles pertaining to artificial intelligence are being evolved in different parts of the world. It's engaged in different projects. I have also created a platform called cyberlawuniversity.com, where I'm offering about 37 courses online on cyber law, cybercrime, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence, blockchain, and even Internet of Things. So when these courses tend to get done by more than 28,500 professionals and students from 174 countries, speaking 53 national languages, the figures are telling us that there's a need for massive capacity building. And therefore, we all must keep on enhancing our capacities pertaining to AI, including generative AI. I've launched a new course on artificial intelligence and its regulation at Udemy, which is available at the following link. Please go and see this particular course. So I have deliberately crafted this course, keeping in mind the fact that nobody today wants gyan or knowledge. Everybody wants, how can I be benefited, or how am I going to be impacted by these newly emerging technologies of generative artificial intelligence? So from a practical standpoint, from a professional standpoint, I have developed this said course. So a lot of people are saying, let's ban Gen AI. In the education sector, there's one thought process. Since all students have started doing their homework by ChatGPT, let's ban ChatGPT. I think the answer is a crystal clear no. You can't just ban away generative AI. The important issue is that you will have to handle generative AI with care. And generative AI is going to open up new vistas of growth and prosperity for human mankind. All said and done, it's a fantastic time that we are living in. And in the next few months and years, we are going to see the further evolution of the legal jurisprudence that's going to go ahead and effectively regulate the entire paradigm of not just generative AI, but artificial intelligence as a whole. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for giving me this opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pavan. That was delightful. I just have one question for you, which is, what do you think is the importance of partnerships and collaboration in moving forward in the future? So when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about countries working together to harmonize regulation, but I'm also looking at how maybe the legal sector and technologists can also work more closely together so that they're speaking the same language.
Well, generative AI is going to be one common language that humanity will speak. So therefore, if you're all speaking the same language, you all must be on the same platform for communication and collaboration. And it's in this regard, collaboration assumes of paramount significance. Why? Because every stakeholder will now have to collaborate. because this is now going to become the common new denominator. Now, it's not just generative AI, it's also how generative AI is going to be used, misused, abused. That becomes a common headache point or a common challenge from the perspective of not just nation states, but also from the perspective of uh, regulators, policymakers, corporates, and even stakeholders at large. Therefore, collaboration on different projects and aspects of generative AI in specific and AI in general has to be the norm of the day, because you can't go ahead and keep on reinventing the wheel. And right now, when we are racing against time, in the next 4 odd years, we're going to see super intelligence evolving, which is going to be far more ahead of human intelligence. We today do not have the time to do individual experiments at national level and then trying to go ahead and realize the ultimate truth. The fact is, we will have to exchange our wisdoms, our experiences, our knowledge, and we'll have to collaborate with each one of them, because the world today has one common big challenge: artificial intelligence. This is a big kind of an elephant, a big lion in the room, which, if it's not going to be reined, could potentially have a prejudicial impact upon the further existence of humanity as a mankind race. That being so, I think we will have to do massive collaboration amongst all stakeholders, whether it's the technical stakeholders, whether it's legal stakeholders, whether it's government, whether it's the private sector, or whether it's not for profit. Because there's going to be hardly any one vertical of human activity and endeavor that's not going to be impacted or touched by generative AI. So the quicker we start collectively sharing our collaboration approaches and our common perspectives on dealing with the issues and challenges of AI, including generative AI, the better it will be. Otherwise, we'll all be working in silos, and with time running against us, we'll quickly realize it's a self-defeating exercise, which is not going to give any kind of substantial benefit to either countries or to their users at large.
Thank you. That's an optimistic note to end on. I look forward to collaborating with you in future, and I'll certainly sign up to some of your courses and read your books. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. Bye-bye.